In the summer of 2004, a married couple in their 50s packed up everything they owned and fled the city for a remote bungalow on the Lincolnshire coast. They told almost no one where they had gone. They had done nothing wrong. Their only mistake was being related to the wrong person, and the man hunting them found them anyway. How does that happen in England, in the home of Robin Hood? For a stretch of years in the early 2000s, national newspapers stopped writing about castles and lace and started calling Nottingham one of the most dangerous cities in Britain. This is the story of how that grim reputation was earned. Across more than 25 years, we will walk through 10 of the most brutal cases from the city's underworld, and you will see that they are not 10 separate tragedies. They are one chain, linking a grandmother at her shop counter, a child walking home from a fair, and a man who only ever wanted to make peace. Section 1. A city with a reputation. For most of its history, Nottingham was known for gentle things. Robin Hood, lace-making, a castle on a hill. It was the kind of place people pictured when they thought of an ordinary English city. Busy, but calm, full of families just getting on with their lives. Then, somewhere in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, that picture began to crack. National newspapers stopped writing about Robin Hood and started writing about something far grimmer. They began calling Nottingham one of the most dangerous cities in Britain. Some of the headlines were so harsh that ordinary residents felt the whole place was being judged for what a tiny handful of people were doing. But the fear underneath those headlines was real. And to understand the stories in this video, you first have to understand the world they grew out of. On the streets, that world had a name. People called it the NG Triangle. The NG comes from the city's postcode, and the triangle was made up of 3 neighbourhoods that sat right next to each other but felt like separate countries: St Anne's, Radford, and the Meadows. On a map, they are only minutes apart. In the minds of the young men who grew up there, the lines between them were treated as real, serious borders. The rivalry was about territory, and territory was about money. Each area had its own crews, its own loyalties, its own pride. Children picked it up almost as soon as they could walk. Some grew up knowing exactly which streets they were not allowed to set foot on. A few even had their postcode marked permanently onto their skin, a way of saying, "This is who I am, and this is where I belong." Even the shopping centres got carved up, one side claimed by St Anne's and Radford, the other treated as Meadows ground. To an outsider, all of this can sound almost childish. To the people living it, getting it wrong could turn a normal afternoon into a trip to hospital. None of this came out of nowhere. It was fed, slowly and steadily, by 2 things that arrived in the city at the same time. The first was the trade in hard substances. Through the late 1980s and the 1990s, stronger and more addictive products spread through these neighbourhoods. Where there is that kind of trade, there is money. And where there is money, there are people willing to fight to control it. Selling became a career for young men who felt the ordinary world had nothing to offer them. Older criminals went hunting for teenagers they could turn into runners, slipping them a bit of cash at first, then slowly pulling them in until they were stuck in that life with no clear way out. The second thing was far more dangerous. Around the same time, the streets started filling up with the kind of item that can turn a stupid argument into a funeral. Some of it came in through criminal networks. A shocking amount came from something that sounds almost unbelievable. A small business that legally sold things which had supposedly been made completely harmless, then quietly told buyers how to bring them back to full working order. The tools to do that were sold for the price of a cheap night out. Once that knowledge was loose, getting hold of something capable of ending a life stopped being hard and started being normal. Carrying one became a status symbol, a way of feeling powerful, long before anyone truly grasped what it would cost. You can see the future taking shape in the children of that time. One group of youngsters from St Anne's became so well known that the city handed them a nickname. They were barely teenagers, the youngest around 12 years old, and between them they were arrested hundreds of times. They came from broken homes and hard estates, and they had decided early on that the rules simply did not apply to them. They were not the cause of everything that followed, but they were a warning sign, written in plain view, that a whole generation was growing up with no fear of the law and no belief that the law would ever look out for them. Sitting above the street crews was something better organised. For years, a large slice of the city's trade ran through one clever, charming and genuinely dangerous man who built a small empire while hiding in plain sight. He even took a respectable job that let him pass himself off as one of the good guys. The police spent years and an enormous amount of effort trying to bring him down, and around the turn of the millennium, they finally managed it and sent him to prison. That should have been a clean win. In a strange way, it made things worse. When you remove the man at the very top of a criminal world, you do not remove the world itself. You just leave an empty chair. Every ambitious crew in the city looked to that empty space and thought the same thing. Why not us? The rough balance that had been holding things together, ugly as it was, suddenly fell apart. Into that gap stepped a new kind of group, led not by the old familiar faces, but by people prepared to be far more ruthless than anyone the city had seen before. This is the ground that everything else in this video stands on. 3 neighbourhoods that could not stand each other, a flood of money, addiction, and street-level power. A generation of kids raised to settle their own scores, and all at once, an empty throne that everyone wanted to claim. One of the first real warnings of how far this new era would go did not involve any of the big names at all. It came in 1996, outside a Nottingham music venue, when a group of young men set upon a single person, and that person did not survive. It was a small, terrible sign of the pattern that was coming, and it is where our story truly begins. Section 2. The First Lives Lost. The warning came in 1996. Outside the Marcus Garvey Centre, a well-known club and community venue in the Lenton part of the city, a man named Barrington Walker was attacked by a group and did not survive. The full story of that night never became widely known, but it was an early, ugly sign that the rules of the street had changed and that an ordinary evening out could now cost a person their life. Then came the case that showed the whole city exactly how bad things had become. It started, almost unbelievably, with spit. In the early hours of the 30th of November 1997, a small group of young men from the Meadows had been to a dance at a centre on Forest Road. As they stood in the car park afterwards, some youths from the St Anne's and Radford side noticed one of the Meadows lads spit on their car. In any normal place, that is nothing, a shrug, maybe a few harsh words. In the world these young men lived in, it was treated as an insult that had to be answered. They went looking for payback. A short while later they spotted the Meadows group outside a fried chicken takeaway on Alfreton Road. Among the St Anne's and Radford crew was a 19-year-old named Shane Thompson. Wearing masks and carrying bats, Thompson and his friends rushed in and struck one of the Meadows youths, an 18-year-old, on the head. What happened next turned a street brawl into something much worse. The 18-year-old pulled out something and fired 3 times into the air. It later turned out the thing was loaded only with blanks, so nobody was actually harmed by it. But no one in that moment knew that. The noise sent Thompson and his friends running in fear up Alfreton Road, and now the roles flipped. The Meadows group, around 15 strong, and some of them now holding lengths of wood and chains, gave chase. They were hunting Thompson and 3 other young men. Thompson got cornered near a pub called the Two in the Bush. He was hit and went crashing into a telephone box, startling the person inside it. He managed to stagger on for a moment, but he was caught and brought down by blow after blow. The group set on him with kicks and with whatever they were carrying. He was on his own against all of them, calling out for them to stop, telling them they were going to end his life. They eventually ran off and left him on the ground, barely conscious. The manager of the nearby pub heard the commotion, came outside, and stayed with him while calling for an ambulance. It arrived at about 2:20 in the morning. Thompson was still able to say a few words to the crew who treated him, but his condition got worse soon after, and he did not pull through. He lost his life in hospital around 18 hours later. He was 19 years old. You might think a street full of people would make a case like this easy to solve. It was the opposite. There were many witnesses, and a large number of young people from both sides were arrested straight away. Then the phone calls started. One by one, witnesses who had agreed to speak began to pull out, frightened off by threats. By the time the matter reached court in October 1998, the case was already coming apart. 7 young men stood trial, 6 from the Meadows and 1 from the St. Anne's side. It was a mess from the start. It was obvious to everyone in the room that not all of the people responsible were actually in the dock. At least one of them had already slipped out of the country to Jamaica, helped, it was said, by a father with serious criminal connections. The prosecution even had a witness from inside the Meadows group who was willing to point out who had struck the decisive blows. But when it came to it, he could not identify 5 of the 6 men charged. On the 5th of November 1998, the judge had little choice. He directed that all 7 defendants be cleared. Every single one of them walked free. A 19-year-old had lost his life in front of dozens of people, and in the eyes of the law, nobody had done it. The judge used the moment to plead for peace. He told the court that the decent people of St. Anne's, Radford, the Meadows and the surrounding areas were long overdue a break from the constant trouble, and that now was as good a time as any for calm to win out. The community tried to answer that call. Hundreds of people came together at a summit at the city's Albert Hall in early 1999, determined to break the postcode divide that was tearing young lives apart. It did not work. It could not. Soon after, graffiti began appearing on street signs in St. Anne's, keeping a running tally of the young men lost on each side, as if it were all just a scoreline. The message underneath was chilling. For a growing number of young people, justice was no longer something that came from a courtroom. Justice was something you handed out yourself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That belief did not stay an idea for long. The next life taken in this long feud would be claimed on a busy road in plain view, almost within sight of a police station, while repeated calls for help went unanswered. And this time, the people responsible would not vanish into a faceless crowd. One of them had already walked out of a courtroom a free man once before. Section 3. The Man Who Stepped In. By 2001, the lesson of the Shane Thompson case had sunk in across these neighbourhoods. If the courts could not, or would not, hold anyone to account, then young men would settle things their own way. And one of the people who had walked out of that 1997 trial a free man was about to show just how dangerous that idea had become. His name was Nicholas Fogo. He had been among the group cleared over Shane Thompson, and in the years that followed, he sank deeper into serious trouble. By early 2001, he and another man, Ashley Graham, were behind a run of violence in the Radford area. The trouble that would define them started, by the account that survives, days earlier, when another man had been badly hurt and later did not pull through. Someone had witnessed it and gone to the police, and so Fogo and Graham went looking for that witness, to frighten him into silence. That hunt is what brought them to a cafe on Radford Road, and it is where a completely innocent man crossed their path. Roy Winston Henry was 32 years old. He had nothing to do with any of the bad blood. He was simply there, outside the cafe, on the day it all came to a head. The witness the 2 men were after had taken shelter inside. They had turned up, been sent away, then come back again a few minutes later, still determined to get to him. The woman running the cafe pushed them out of the doorway and kept the frightened man inside where he was safe. Roy Henry could have looked the other way. Plenty of people would have. Getting involved in someone else's quarrel in that part of the city, in that era, was a good way to make yourself a target. But Henry stepped in anyway. He stood between the two men and the cafe, and he told them, in plain words, not to be stupid. For that, they turned on him. What the two of them did next was cold and deliberate. They became aggressive towards Henry, then tried to coax him away from the cafe entrance, away from the one spot where a security camera could see exactly what was happening. They picked up a brick and a bottle. They were each carrying something sharp, and in the struggle that followed, one of them drove a single, terrible wound into Roy Henry's chest. It reached his heart. He did not survive. He had been alive minutes earlier, a bystander doing the most ordinary, decent thing a person can do, stepping in to protect a stranger. And now, he was gone. On a public street, in front of a cafe, in the middle of the afternoon. Here is the detail that should stay with you. This happened only a few hundred yards from a police station. Help was, quite literally, just up the road. And yet, when it mattered most, that help did not come in time. Police did not arrive until after 4 separate emergency calls had been made. By the time anyone in a uniform reached the scene, it was already far too late for Roy Henry. Think about what that says about the city in 2001. Not that the police did not care, but that the violence had grown so frequent, so woven into daily life in these few streets, that a man could lose his life within shouting distance of a police station while phone after phone call went out begging for someone to come. The danger had become normal. The protection had not kept up. There was, in the end, a kind of justice this time, and that is what set this case apart from Shane Thompson's. Nicholas Fogo and Ashley Graham were both caught, both put on trial, and both convicted. Each of them was handed a life sentence. The same man who had walked free from one courtroom a few years earlier would not walk free again. Their defense told you everything about the mindset that had taken hold. Both men claimed, when it came to trial, that they had believed Roy Henry was carrying something dangerous in his pocket, that they had acted out of some imagined threat. There was nothing in his pocket. There was no threat. There was only a 32-year-old man who had told 2 aggressive strangers to leave another man alone. In the world these young men had built for themselves, that was treated as reason enough. Roy Henry's case is easy to overlook because he was not a famous figure and his name did not lead the news for years afterwards. But it sits at the centre of what this video is really about. Up to this point, the loss of life in Nottingham had largely been gang against gang, one crew chasing another, young men who had chosen this life paying the price for it. Roy Henry had chosen none of it. He was the moment the violence stopped staying inside its own circle and started reaching ordinary people who simply got too close. That was the inner city, where the trouble was loud, messy, and often leaderless. A war of crews and postcodes and wounded pride. But a few miles to the north, on a single housing estate, something very different was taking shape. It was quieter. It was patient. It was organised in a way the street crews never were. And one ordinary evening in 2003, outside a pub, a mistake made by that organisation would light the fuse on the most infamous chain of events the city had ever known. Section 4. The Wrong Man. A few miles north of the inner city postcodes sat a large housing estate called Bestwood. By the early 2000s, Bestwood belonged, in every way that mattered, to 2 brothers. Colin and David Gunn were not like the loose, hot-headed street crews of St Anne's and Radford. They were something more disciplined and far more frightening. An organisation. Colin Gunn, in particular, had started small, a low-level offender who once did time for a cheque scam, but he grew into the most feared man in the city. He and his brother ran the estate through a blend of fear and money. They took protection payments from local shops, pubs and clubs. They controlled a large slice of the drug trade. and they made sure everyone understood what happened to people who crossed them, through beatings and threats so extreme that the whole estate learned to keep its mouth shut. Colin Gunn even seemed to enjoy his own reputation, modelling himself on the gangster figures he had seen in films. This was the machine humming away in the north of the city, while the inner city feuds raged on. And in the summer of 2003, that machine crashed into the life of a completely ordinary young man. His name was Marvin Bradshaw. He was 22, a clean-living shopfitter from the Bestwood area who had nothing to do with the criminal world around him. He did not take drugs or run with gangs. By every account, he was just a decent lad with a steady job and a tight circle of friends. At the end of August 2003, Marvin went out for a drink with his best friend at the Sporting Chance pub in Bulwell. The two of them were inseparable. They stayed for a lock-in, the kind of after-hours drink-up where the doors are shut and a few regulars carry on, and they did not leave until 3:45 in the morning. Marvin had not touched a drop. He was the designated driver, giving a lift home to his friend and two other men. Earlier that same night, another young man had been having a very different evening. Michael O'Brien had been turned away from a city nightclub over how he was dressed, and had reacted badly, threatening one of the doormen. He and a friend named Gary Salmon then showed up at the Sporting Chance, were refused entry, and got into a row. In the middle of it, O'Brien was struck in the face with an ashtray, leaving a cut above his eye. Humiliated and furious, he decided to get even with the people from that pub. So O'Brien and Salmon went back to Salmon's house, changed into dark clothing, gloves and balaclavas, and Salmon fetched something long, wrapped up inside a coat. O'Brien took it and returned to the Sporting Chance to wait. As Marvin steered the car out of the car park at 3:45, a figure stepped into the glare of the headlights and opened fire straight into the vehicle. The shot was never meant for Marvin. O'Brien had been aiming for one of the passengers, a young man he had clashed with that night. But it was Marvin behind the wheel who was hit. He did not survive. A 22-year-old with no part in any of this lost his life in a car park at 4 in the morning over an argument that had nothing to do with him. Around 700 people came to his funeral at a church in Bulwell. The law caught up with both men. Michael O'Brien and Gary Salmon were each convicted at Nottingham Crown Court, and each was handed a life sentence. O'Brien was told he would serve a long minimum term before he could even be considered for release. On paper, that should have been the end of it. A senseless loss, followed by justice. It was not the end. It was the beginning. And the reason was who had been sitting in that car. The passenger O'Brien had actually been aiming for was a young man named Jamie Gunn. And Jamie Gunn was the nephew of Colin Gunn, the man who ran Bestwood. Marvin had been Jamie's closest friend, and Jamie was in the car when it happened. He was not physically harmed, but something in him broke that night and never healed. He started drinking heavily, stopped looking after himself, and would vanish for days at a time. He grew thin and pale. Even learning in early 2004 that he was going to become a father was not enough to pull him back. His health kept sliding, his body stopped fighting off illness, and in August 2004, only days after O'Brien was sentenced, Jamie passed away at home. He was 19. The official cause was pneumonia. He was laid to rest close to Marvin, the friend he had lost a year before. To most families, that would have been a second, crushing blow to absorb. To Colin Gunn, it was something else. In his mind, the person who had taken Marvin that night had now taken his nephew too. It did not matter to him that O'Brien was already locked away for life. He wanted his own kind of payback, and he had the money, the network, and the cold patience to get it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But here is the part that shows just how far a man like Colin Gunn was willing to go. He did not go after O'Brien himself, who was beyond his reach behind bars. He turned instead on O'Brien's family, ordinary people who had done nothing wrong. They had already run from the city in fear once before, and they believed they had finally found somewhere quiet and safe to hide. Section 5. Nowhere left to hide. John and Joan Sterland were not criminals. They were a married couple in their 50s living quiet, unremarkable lives. John was 55, Joan was 51. Their only connection to any of this was an accident of family. Joan was the mother of Michael O'Brien, the young man responsible for the loss of Marvin Bradshaw the year before. John was O'Brien's stepfather. Neither of them had been anywhere near that pub car park. Neither had done a single thing wrong. But in Colin Gunn's world, that did not matter. To him, the family of the person who had set off his nephew's downfall was a target, and family was something he could reach. The Sterlands knew they were in danger long before the worst happened. After the Bradshaw shooting, while O'Brien sat in custody, their Nottingham home was targeted in a frightening attack. The message could not have been clearer. So they did the only sensible thing left to them. They packed up their lives and moved away from the city entirely, to a small bungalow in the village of Trusthorpe on the Lincolnshire coast near Mablethorpe. It was the kind of sleepy seaside spot where nothing ever happens. They were trying simply to vanish and stay alive. For a while, it seemed they had managed it. They had told almost no one where they were. They lived carefully and kept their heads down. By every measure, they had done everything a frightened couple could be expected to do to protect themselves. What they did not know was the reach of the man hunting them. Colin Gunn did not just run an estate through fear. He had spent years building a web of corrupt contacts, including people inside organisations that should never have been working for him. This is one of the most disturbing parts of the whole story. Gunn had informants feeding him information, and over the years, he used them to stay a step ahead of the very people trying to bring him down. That same network of corruption is what let him do the unthinkable. Trace two people who had disappeared to a tiny coastal village hundreds of miles away. On the 8th of August 2004, only days after Gunn's nephew Jamie had passed away, two people arrived at that quiet bungalow in Trusthorpe. Inside were John and Joan. What happened next was not a robbery, not an argument, not a fight that got out of hand. It was a calm, planned attack on two defenceless people in their own home. Both John and Joan lost their lives. A middle-aged couple who had run to the seaside to be safe had everything taken from them in the one place they believed no one could find them. The two people who actually carried it out were never identified. To this day, no one has been caught for physically doing it. They arrived, they did what they had been sent to do, and they slipped away, leaving behind a scene that stunned a county more used to summer holidaymakers than anything like this. But the absence of those two figures did not mean the absence of justice, because everyone who understood the case understood who was truly behind it. The order had come from Nottingham. It had come from Colin Gunn. The investigation that followed was enormous, and it turned over far more than anyone expected. As detectives dug into how Gunn had operated for so long, they uncovered the corruption that had shielded him, the leaks and the inside help that had kept him one step ahead. It became not just a case about two lives taken on the coast, but a case about how one man had managed to bend parts of the system to his will. In June 2006, Colin Gunn was convicted of plotting the attack on the Sterlands. He was jailed for life and told he would serve at least 35 years before he could even be considered for release. The most feared man in Nottingham was finally locked away. And yet, even that did not fully switch off his power. Years later, from inside a high-security prison, Gunn was still able to make people afraid. In one chilling episode, he arranged for a note to be passed to a prison officer. Written on it was the home address of that officer's disabled brother, along with a message making clear that the officer now answered to Colin Gunn. This was a man who, even behind bars, wanted everyone to know that his reach had no edges. What was done to John and Joan Sterland was the moment Nottingham's reputation hardened into something national. This was no longer young men chasing each other over postcodes. This was an organised operation reaching right across the country to end the lives of two innocent people whose only mistake was being related to someone. It was cold, it was deliberate, and it was carried out with a confidence that suggested whoever did it believed they would never be caught. In the case of the two who pulled it off, they were proven right. For a time, the gun name swallowed up almost everything written about crime in the city. But it would be a mistake to think the danger of these years lived only inside the underworld and the families tangled up in it. The same wave of armed crime was reaching people with no link to any of it at all. And one ordinary day, in a quiet shop in a Nottingham suburb, a woman who had simply gone into work would never come home. Section 6. A Mother's Instinct. While the city's newspapers filled up with the gun name, another loss from this same stretch of time deserves just as much attention. It had nothing to do with rival crews or revenge or family feuds. It involved a 64-year-old grandmother, a family shop, and the simple, terrible fact that by 2003, someone was willing to walk into an ordinary jeweller's in the middle of the day while carrying something that could end a life. Her name was Marion Bates. She and her husband Victor ran a jewellery shop called the Time Centre on Front Street in Arnold, a busy town just north of Nottingham. This was not a front for anything. It was a genuine family business, the kind of local shop that had served the same streets for years. Marion was a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. On the 30th of September 2003, she went into work as she had countless times before. That afternoon, two robbers burst into the shop. One of them was armed. Marion's grown-up daughter Xanthi was there too, and in the chaos of those first few seconds, one of the robbers turned and aimed his weapon directly at Xanthi. What Marion did next is the heart of this story. She did not freeze, she did not run. She stepped straight in between her daughter and the armed man, putting her own body in the way. People who followed the case later described it as an instinctive act of bravery, a mother refusing to let her child be harmed, refusing to let her two grandsons grow up without their mum. In that instant, she made herself the target instead of her daughter. She was hit, and she did not survive. Marion Bates lost her life on the floor of her own shop, having spent her final moments protecting her child. It got worse on the way out. As the two robbers fled, the younger of them, a 19-year-old named Peter Williams, attacked Marion's husband Victor with a crowbar. Victor was 66 years old. He was beaten as the pair tried to clear their escape, but he came through it alive. And here is the part that made the whole thing even harder to bear. It was a bungled robbery, a raid that went wrong from the start. A respectable woman had been taken from her family, and her husband left injured, for a crime that failed even in its own cowardly aim. There was no logic to any of it that could ever make sense to the people who loved her. The case caused enormous public anger, and it is easy to see why. This was not a shooting on a dark estate at 4 a.m. This happened in broad daylight, on a normal shopping street, in a town where families went about their everyday business. The judge who later handled the case said the act showed a complete contempt for human life, and that the public were rightly appalled that a robbery could be carried out with a weapon used in the middle of a busy shopping area. It forced ordinary people to ask a frightening question. If it could happen at the Time Centre, where was actually safe? Justice for Marion Bates came in pieces and never completely. The man believed to have been holding the weapon, James Brodie, was never caught. Police came to believe that Brodie was dead. Marion's husband Victor was never so sure, and he would spend years living with the knowledge that the person who took his wife had simply vanished. For a grieving family, there is a special kind of pain in that, the feeling of a story left forever unfinished. The accomplice, though, did not get away with it. Peter Williams was put on trial at Stafford Crown Court and convicted of taking Marion's life. In 2005, he was sentenced to a minimum of 22 years. On top of that, he was convicted of seriously harming Victor and of a separate charge over the weapon. He had been in trouble with the courts since the age of 13, a young man with a long history of theft and burglary who had now crossed into something far darker. There was one more thread, and it ties this case back into the larger story of the city. A man named Craig Moran was later jailed for 13 years for his part in planning the raid. And Moran was no random street thief. He had come up through the criminal group based on the Bestwood estate, the same world that produced Colin Gunn. So while the Bates case looked, on the surface, like a robbery gone wrong, it was stitched into the very same network of organised crime that had been tightening its grip on Nottingham for years. Once that kind of danger was loose on the streets, it respected no boundary between the gangland world and ordinary life. Anyone could end up in its path. Marion Bates is remembered now not as a crime statistic, but as a mother who did the bravest thing a parent can do. She stood between danger and her child without a moment's hesitation, and it cost her everything. Her daughter lived. Her grandsons kept their mother. That was the trade Marion made in a single second, and she made it without flinching. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By this point in the story, the people being lost had grown impossibly varied. A gang member chased through the streets, an innocent young driver, a quiet couple by the sea, a grandmother at her shop counter. But there was still one loss to come that struck the city harder than almost any other, because of who it took. She was just 14 years old, and all she had done was walk home from a night out at the fair. Section 7. Walking Home. The postcode war between St Anne's and the Meadows, the one that had already taken Shane Thompson back in 1997, never really stopped. All through the years of the gun saga, it kept simmering away in the background, crew against crew, area against area, and in October 2004, it produced the loss that, more than any other, made the whole city stop and ask what it had let itself become. Her name was Danielle Becken. She was 14 years old. She lived in St Anne's. She loved acting, and she was, by every account, a bright and ordinary schoolgirl with her whole life in front of her. She had no connection to any gang. She was a child. That October, Danielle went out for a night that thousands of Nottingham youngsters enjoy every single year. She went to the Goose Fair, the city's enormous annual fun fair, the kind of place full of rides and lights and noise and candy floss. It is about as innocent a night out as a teenager can have. She went with friends, and afterwards they set off home together on foot, heading back towards St Anne's. As they walked, a car came along the road near her home. It was a Citroën, and inside it were several young men. As the car drew level with the group of friends, someone inside opened fire toward them. Danielle was hit in the stomach. Her mother, Paula Platt, reached her in the minutes that followed and held her daughter close, but the wound was too serious. Danielle was taken to hospital, and there she lost her life. A 14-year-old girl who had done nothing but walk home from a fair was gone. It is hard to put into words how senseless this was, and the reason behind it only makes it worse. The men in that car were part of a group known as the Waterfront Gang, based in the Meadows, the rival side of that long-running postcode feud. The attack was aimed at the St Anne's area as part of the rivalry. Danielle was not a target. She was not anyone's enemy. She simply lived in the wrong place and was walking down the wrong street at the wrong moment. And that was enough to cost a child her life. Think about what that tells you. By 2004, the feud had become so blind, so cut off from anything resembling reason, that the people caught up in it were willing to attack a group on a residential street without knowing or caring who was standing in it. To them, the postcode was the target. The actual human beings inside it did not seem to matter at all. The city was stunned. There is something about the loss of a child that cuts straight through everything else. And Danielle's death did exactly that. People who had trained themselves to look away from gang violence, who had told themselves it only touched those who chose that life, could not look away from this one. A 14-year-old. walking home from the fair. It was impossible to file away as somebody else's problem. For once, the wider community refused to stay quiet in the way that had let so many earlier cases fall apart. The pressure to find those responsible was huge. In the end, 2 men were brought to justice. Mark Kelly, who was 20, and Junior Andrews, who was 23, were both convicted of taking Danielle's life at Birmingham Crown Court, and both were jailed for life. But there were others in that car who never stood before a court. Police kept searching for the other men who had been inside the Citroën that night, and the case left a lingering sense that not everyone responsible had answered for it. What stands out, looking back, is how Danielle's family responded to something that could so easily have swallowed them whole. Her mother became a voice for change, determined to steer young people away from the streets and towards something better. Danielle's name was kept alive through a memorial fund set up to support community projects, and years later, part of a leisure centre in the city was dedicated to her, so her name would be tied to young people doing positive things rather than only to the night she was taken. For a girl who had loved acting and performing, there is something right about that. Her memory linked to creativity and life, rather than to the act that ended hers. Danielle Beckon's loss sits at the centre of this whole story for one plain reason. Every other case we have looked at involved adults who had, in some way, brushed up against the criminal world, whether through choice, through family, or through the sheer bad luck of being nearby. Danielle was a 14-year-old child whose only link to any of it was her address. If you ever wanted proof that the violence of these years had stopped making any sense, proof that it had curdled into something pointless and self-feeding, it was her. You might think a loss this raw would have jolted the city into permanent change, that nothing so senseless could ever be allowed to happen again. And for a long stretch afterwards, as the big names were locked away and Nottingham worked hard to scrub the grim reputation off itself, it really did look as though the worst was finally behind it. But the forces underneath all of this never truly went away. They simply went quiet and changed their shape, and years later they would rise again in the busy heart of the city, claiming another young life in front of everyone around. Section 8. The Heart of the City. The years after Danielle Beckon changed Nottingham, the big names were locked away, police poured resources into the worst estates. Slowly, the city began to climb out from under its reputation, and for a long while, the kind of violence that had defined the early 2000s seemed to belong to the past. But the thinking that drove it never fully died. It simply traded one kind of weapon for another, quieter one that was, in its own way, just as dangerous. By 2020, the postcode rivalries of the city were being settled with blades. Kini Crystal Kisingu Mabiala was 20 years old. He was a musician, an aspiring one, but a real talent with a real following. He had put songs out on the internet that had been played tens of thousands of times, and he was becoming a recognised face in the local music scene. He was a young man building something for himself, the kind of person a city should be proud of. He had dreams, and he was chasing them. On Monday the 12th of October 2020, Kini was walking through the centre of Nottingham at lunchtime. He was on Milton Street, right next to the Victoria Centre, one of the busiest and most public spots in the entire city. It was the middle of the day. The street was full of shoppers. Kini was alone, completely unarmed, and he was on his phone, talking to his bank. He was, in the simplest possible terms, minding his own business. 2 young men were also in the city centre that day. Mazin Abdelmonim was 19. His companion, Devane Paris, was 17. They were from the Radford area, and both of them were carrying large blades hidden down their trousers. As they crossed paths with Kini, they recognised him, partly from his music videos, and because Kini was linked to a rival part of the city, that chance meeting turned, within seconds, into something terrible. A confrontation flared. Abdelmonim pulled out an enormous blade, so big that some people who saw it thought it was a sword. He used it on Kini twice, one of the wounds reaching his heart. Badly hurt, Kini still managed to ask people nearby to call an ambulance. He took a few steps. Then he collapsed onto the pavement outside the shopping centre. Members of the public tried to help him, and then paramedics and police did everything they could. It was not enough. Keeney lost his life right there, in the open, in front of horrified strangers. The thing that makes this so chilling is how little it took. There was no long feud between these particular young men.
Abdelmonem did not even really know his victim. It was a chance encounter, a flicker of recognition, a sense that Keeney belonged to the wrong side of some invisible line, and that was the entire reason a talented 20-year-old never made it home. He was attacked, in the words used afterwards, completely out of the blue. Abdelmonem ran, but he made a careless mistake that would undo him. As he fled, he dropped his phone on the street. When his mother later rang that phone, police were able to trace exactly whose it was, and they arrested him the very next day. His companion, Paris, tried to get away in a taxi, but the drivers would not let him in, so he ran for a bus instead. He too was caught. The case went to Nottingham Crown Court the following year. In June 2021, Mazen Abdelmonem was found guilty of taking Keeney's life and was jailed for life, with the order that he serve at least 20 years before he could be considered for release.
The judge captured the horror of where it had happened in a single, unforgettable image, describing it as being like driving a blade into the very heart of the city. Paris was cleared of the most serious charge, but he admitted carrying a blade in public, and, as one detective put it, he had thrown his own life away in the process. Step back and look at what this case really shows. 16 years earlier, Danielle Becken had lost her life because she lived in the wrong postcode, hit by people firing from a passing car. Now, in 2020, a young musician lost his because he was linked to the wrong area, attacked by strangers in the middle of a shopping street. The weapon had changed. The car and the firearm of the early 2000s had been swapped for blades carried down the trousers of teenagers. But the sickness underneath was exactly the same.
Young men were still carving the city into us and them, still carrying things made to harm, still willing to end a life over which streets a stranger came from. There is one more cruel detail worth sitting with. Keeney was recognised partly because of his music, the very thing he was using to build a future and rise above the streets around him. The talent that should have been his way out instead made him a face that someone knew on the wrong day, in the wrong place. He did everything right, and it still found him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened to Keeney Kisingu Mabiala was a chance meeting that spun out of control in seconds. But the older, colder kind of violence, the planned and organised sort that had powered the Bestwood years, had not gone anywhere either. Just over a year later, in the Meadows, it would return in its most calculated form yet, with a team of strangers brought in from another city to carry out a carefully arranged attack. And the man who lost his life that night would not even be the person they had been sent to find. Section 9. The Peacemaker. The kind of violence that took Keeney was sudden and personal, 2 strangers and a few seconds of madness. But the older, more organised kind never disappeared, and by 2021 it was alive and well in the Meadows. 2 rival gangs were locked in a war for control of the drug trade in that part of the city. This was not hot-headed youngsters squabbling over pride. It was business, run with the cold logic of a business, and the people at the top were prepared to treat human lives as nothing more than problems to be removed. One side decided the way to win was to take out the leader of the other, a man who ran a rival operation. So they planned an ambush, and the way they went about it tells you just how professional this world had become. They did not rely only on local muscle. They brought in a team of strangers from Manchester, hired hands with no ties to the area, to help carry out the attack. This was organised crime behaving like a company that hires contractors for a job, except the job was to end a man's life. The man they wanted was a gang boss. The man who actually walked into their trap was not. His name was Michael Anton O'Connor. He was 31 years old, well known and genuinely well liked in the community. He was not a gang leader.
He was not even the target. On the night of the 10th of November 2021, with tensions between the two sides boiling over, O'Connor was asked, at the last minute, to go to a meeting in the gang boss's place. The idea was that he might be able to calm things down, to reason with the rival side, to act as a peacemaker in a war that was spinning out of control. He agreed to go. He went unarmed, and he had no idea that he was walking straight into a trap. The meeting was on a street called Wilford Crescent West, late that night. Waiting there was a group of people wearing balaclavas and carrying blades, including a sword. They had set the trap for the gang boss. When O'Connor arrived in the boss's place, they treated him as the man they had come for. In the brutal, pre-planned attack that followed, O'Connor was wounded once, a single blow that reached his heart. He was rushed to hospital, but the injury was too severe. Michael Anton O'Connor lost his life that night, a man who had shown up trying to stop the fighting, brought down by a trap meant for somebody else. Sit with how bitter that is for a moment. In a war full of people looking to harm each other, the one person who lost his life was the one who had come to make peace. He was unarmed. He was there to talk. He was, by every account, a decent man, trusted enough by both sides to be sent in as a go-between.
And that trust is exactly what cost him everything. The investigation that followed was enormous because so many people had played a part. This was not the work of one or two individuals. It involved the planners, the local gang members, the hired team from Manchester, the person who drove them down, and the people who helped set the meeting up. When it finally reached court, 13 people stood trial in connection with what happened to O'Connor. 11 of them were convicted. 9 were found guilty of taking his life. Between them, the people responsible were handed many decades behind bars. What this case revealed was how far the city's underworld had evolved since the Bestwood years. Back then, one organisation had ruled through fear. Now the structure was different, but in some ways more chilling. Here were rival groups treating the drug trade like a marketplace worth ending lives over, importing crews from other cities the way a firm might bring in outside staff, and planning attacks with the cold care of people arranging a delivery. The messy chaos of the old postcode feuds had been replaced by something colder and more deliberate. And it was still ending the lives of people who got too close. There is a particular darkness in the O'Connor case. The others we have looked at were swept up in violence they had no part in, whether by accident, by family, or by simply being nearby. O'Connor was different. He was not a bystander at all. He had stepped forward on purpose to try to calm a war full of people who had lost all sense of proportion. He took on the role of peacemaker, and the war answered by taking his life. His loss is a reminder that this kind of violence does not only punish the people who choose it. It reaches outward and pulls in anyone within range, including, in the cruelest twist of all, the people brave enough to try to end it. By 2021, the organised side of Nottingham's Underworld had become a machine that could plan a man's downfall with the patience of a business deal. It had simply found new ways to do the same old thing. But not every loss in these recent years was so cold and calculated. Some still came from the rawest, most human source of all, which is revenge. And just a few months after O'Connor, in the early hours outside a city centre bar, a father who was only out of prison for a short visit home would be hunted through the street by a group determined to settle an old score. Section 10. An old score. The final case in this story strips everything back to the oldest and most human reason for violence there is. Not territory, not the drug trade, not a mistake or a matter of wrong place, wrong time. This one came down to a single, simple, ancient impulse, which is the desire to settle a score. Ricardo Cotterell was 33 years old and a father of 2 young children, aged 11 and 8. His family remembered him as a family man and an inspiration. At the time this happened, he was in prison, but he had been let out on a short weekend release, the kind of brief return home that prisoners are sometimes granted. For Ricardo, it should have been a simple thing. A couple of days back in the city, a chance to breathe. Instead, it became the weekend he never came back from.
Some time before, there had been a violent incident involving Ricardo and a group of other men. The details of that earlier clash matter less than what it left behind, which was a deep, lasting hostility, a sense of unfinished business that festered and waited. And when those men learned that Ricardo was briefly out of prison and back in Nottingham, they decided this was their chance to act on it.
What they did was not a heat-of-the-moment flare-up. It was planned, step by step. In the early hours of the 24th of April 2022, a group of them travelled into the city centre in 2 cars. They made their way to a venue called Wax Bar on Broad Street. They went inside and were patted down by door staff on the way in. Then they left, went back out to their cars, and returned to the bar a second time, this time slipping in without being searched. In between those 2 visits, some of them had armed themselves with blades. They posted lookouts by the windows of the bar, and they waited. They were not there for a night out. They were there for Ricardo. When Ricardo approached the bar, the lookouts gave the signal. The men moved on him outside, in the street, and attacked. Ricardo tried to escape. He ran down the road, hurt, desperate to get away. But they chased him, caught him, and set on him again, attacking him a second time as he tried to flee.
He was wounded many times, with one of those wounds reaching his heart. He collapsed onto the pavement. The group only stopped and walked away once one of them had announced that he was gone. Despite the efforts to help him at the scene, Ricardo Cotterell lost his life there in the street, in the middle of the city, a short distance from the bar. A father of 2, briefly home from prison to be near his family, hunted down and surrounded by men acting on a grudge. There was no escape route they had not already cut off, no chance they had not closed down. It was, in the words used in court, planned and premeditated, an act of pure revenge. In the aftermath, the men who did it went to extraordinary lengths to disappear. They fled the area, they got rid of the blades they had used, threw away the clothes they had worn, and ditched their phones. The man who had landed the blow that took Ricardo's life was moved from place to place across the country and hidden by various people for weeks.
His car was concealed under a cover at one address. He was passed along and sheltered, first in one city and then another. At one point, he and his brother even tried to board a flight out of the country, hoping to reach Jamaica and slip beyond the reach of the law altogether. They did not make it. The investigation that brought them down was painstaking. Detectives pieced the night back together using camera footage, forensic evidence, and mobile phone records, and within a few weeks, they had made their arrests. The case eventually led to 4 men being convicted of taking Ricardo's life. The one who had landed the blow that ended it was jailed for life and told he would serve at least 30 years. His brother and a third attacker were each given life with a minimum of 27 years. The lookout and getaway driver, though he never laid a hand on Ricardo himself, was also jailed for life, with a minimum of 25 years, because he had made the whole thing possible. Between the 4 of them, they were sentenced to more than a century behind bars. On top of that, several other people were later punished for the help they gave the attackers afterwards, for hiding them and trying to keep them out of the hands of the police. What lingers about Ricardo Cotterell's case is its sheer coldness. This was not young men lashing out in panic. It was a calm, organised decision to end a man's life over an old grievance, carried out by people patient enough to follow him, trap him, and then methodically cover their tracks. The setting had changed from the Bestwood estate of 20 years earlier, and the faces were different, but the mindset was painfully familiar. A wrong, real or imagined, had to be answered, and the only payment anyone was willing to accept was a life. That is where the long list of names ends, at least for this video. But a list of cases, however carefully told, is not the same as understanding them. So before we finish, it is worth pulling back from the individual streets and dates and asking the harder questions. Why did this one city produce so much of this? What ties a grandmother in a jeweller's, a child at a fairground, and a father outside a bar into a single story? And after everything we have seen, is any of it really over? If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.